Welcome to Deadline, exciting, vibrant, intelligent discussion where politics and media meet. I'm Carey Campbell. On our show today, the 2012 elections. Hollywood, TV, movie star Roseanne Barr shakes up the Green Party presidential primary race. And at the last minute, Roseanne qualifies for the California primary ballot. And further surprise, a TMZ poll shows her trailing the president by only 3 points. And of course, Rick Santorum goes 3-0. In France, Merkozy runs for president. German Chancellor Merkel campaigns with Sarkozy, suffering at only 20% in the opinion polls. And then we move on to the economy. The U.S. unemployment down, the stock market up, China high-speed rail and solar business booming. And Greece on a slippery slope? What would Plato and Socrates say? Hey, buddy, can you spare $1 billion? And in our Man on the Street feature, is the media biased? Does a wolf howl at the moon? The Arab awakening. Egypt's military responds to demonstrations and moves up the presidential elections. With us on the show today, Lauren Stansbury is a media strategies consultant. Lauren Stansbury, welcome. Kevin G. Hall. Kevin G. Hall is a national economics reporter for the McClatchy newspapers. Welcome, Kevin Hall. And Andrew Bond. Andrew Bond is a political analyst at the Gulf Institute. Welcome all. All right. The entertainment value of American politics. Roseanne Barr in the game and doing surprisingly well right out of the polls. Lauren, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm excited to see if Roseanne Barr does make it into the 2012 campaign as a candidate. I think she has a unique position in being able to challenge the other candidates on questions that they may not be very comfortable talking about. So I'm looking forward to seeing how she upsets the traditional sort of expected debate that we're used to seeing.
And some of those questions that, one point, for example, that she picked up on the party's founder, Petra Kelly, always said that she's running a campaign that's not left, not right, but for the 99% and against the 1%. What do you think, sir?
Well, what I find interesting is the fact think back to 2000 and how the presence of a gadfly candidate made such a difference. You can see an environment that should she happen to get that nomination, she could be kind of a protest vote candidate that sucks up some of the independent vote, but also it would take a hit on presumably more on Obama and the Democrats than it would on the Republicans. On the flip side, you might have Ron Paul then decide he wants to run as an independent as well, and then you really have a four-way race with 2 protest votes, and it could get very interesting.
And our expert from the Gulf Institute, Andrew Bond. Andrew, Roseanne Barr, a potential factor for the Green Party?
Definitely. I mean, Roseanne spent the whole 90s with the Roseanne Show understanding what it was like to be an average American through a show. She knows the hardships that Americans have to go through, especially, this whole average American mentality that we've been having lately. So go for it.
All right, we're going to go out on the street now to one of our features and see what men and women on the street have to say.
Well, I'm a progressive, so I'm hoping that Obama's reelected. But I think that voters are being sadly misinformed by a media that is falling too far on the right and too far on the left and not giving people real information.
I think Mitt Romney is my favorite candidate, if only for entertainment value. One, I think Mormons are in right now. I really like the Book of Mormon on Broadway. And 2, he's just such a ridiculous, the concept of him is so absurd. One of my friends created this website called, what was it called? I paid more than Mitt Romney or something. I paid more than Mitt in taxes, and you can calculate your tax rate, and it's just like, I made 1/10 of 100% of what he made and paid more in taxes than he did. So just the idea of him being president is a little ridiculous.
I hope the incumbent remains in place. And I think what I've seen from the other side has been kind of contentious.
Lauren Stansberg, did you agree or disagree with any of the things you heard there?
Well, I think it's important to remember that what the Green Party does that's so appealing for many American voters is that they really challenge the binary linguistics of American politics. Left and right, Republican, Democrat, those platforms don't fully represent the diversity of interests that you find across the United States. And so I am looking forward to seeing whether Roseanne Barr can challenge the way we talk about politics and challenge the way that the public is constantly being fragmented and divided.
And of course, what we want to go to and also bring in is the big victor this week, Rick Santorum of the Republican Party. Kevin G. Hall, did you see that coming?
Well, the fact that it was a straw poll and that wasn't a more traditional type of primary, there was a lot of speculation that could happen. I think the fact that Gingrich did so well and had so many negatives made people think that there's a very good likelihood that conservatives will rally around Santorum because Gingrich has so much baggage. So in some ways, it's a backdoor victory for Romney because now you've got the split conservative vote and the libertarian vote going to Ron Paul, and he can pretty much between those three splits, he comes out ahead in most counts.
So Romney, you're saying, comes out on top of that. Andrew Bond, what's your take?
Well, I agree with what my colleague just said, and honestly, nothing in this primary has surprised me so far because everything's been a surprise. So whatever happens next is fine.
Hard to top.
Well, one other thing we want to talk about, of course, is this fight that's going on between Obama and the Republican candidates. And, of course, we want to mention Dr. Jill Stein, who actually is winning the Green Party primary since Roseanne just got in, the traditionally more serious candidate. Obama went up in the polls last week. The economy seems to be improving. The frequency of positive statements about him on Twitter seems to be going up. Lauren, how do you see that dynamic playing?
Well, I think that this dialogue that we're hearing from Santorum, this Obama's assault on religion is what he's calling it. I think that for the moment that appeals to the conservative demographic he's reaching out to. I don't think we'll be hearing that language in the fall if he is a candidate, because it doesn't have the mass appeal to the variety of religious perspectives that exist in the United States. I think what's also important to mention about Rick Santorum is that, well, first of all, the process of colonizing women's bodies has been going on long since before the inception of modern government. And whereas the conservative strategy has for a long time been to try to outlaw abortion or make abortion legal, we're seeing that strategy shift now, especially with Santorum's campaign, where the focus is now on trying to prevent women from receiving birth control. In the heyday of this frenzy of whether Obamacare is persecuting religious organizations by offering their employees birth control through their health care plans. It's a very distracting object in the media for people to focus on. But what's happening behind the public lens in Congress is that Senator Rubio from Florida has recently introduced an act called I believe it's the Restoration of Religious Freedoms Act, which would actually allow any entity, regardless of whether it's legally identified as a religious entity, to deny birth control to women in their health care plans because they can cite a religious reason. And I think that we need to expose how this debate is really taking shape, because it has dangerous consequences down the road if it gains momentum.
So you're saying the whole abortion issue that is coming in a different guise or in a different form in this cycle now, in this election cycle. And the Obama administration, Lauren, seemed to back right up off of that this week. Wasn't the president in the Rose Garden just yesterday backing up on that issue?
Absolutely, but let's remember that the Constitution's purpose in separating the powers from church and state is not to put religious organizations outside the consequences of the law. And I think that the Obama administration may have to sort of reshape its policy on this, but they can't back away from the women's rights issue if they want to be successful in this next campaign.
It seems also indicative of where Republicans are. The economy improving, all the outlook for, although not tremendous growth this year, improving growth, certainly job growth is going to look better even if the economy lumbers along. And I think suddenly now where people were sure this was going to be a debate about the economy, maybe it's not. Maybe you're going to have these social issues. And I think if it's a campaign on social issues, I think Obama probably feels pretty good.
And on the economy, Mr. Bond, are we heading north? Are we moving up?
Slowly, I'd say, very slowly. I mean, I'm not the economic expert here. That would be my colleague, to my right, Kevin McHale. I got that
Hall.
correct.
Kevin G. Hall. Kevin G. Hall.
McHale was a great basketball player.
But I mean, everybody thought that this election year was going to be about the economy, and so far it's looking it may not. It might be going into social issues. So, plus one for the Democrats right now, as the economy goes.
Well, Mr. Bond has raised an important point. We want to take advantage of your economic expertise. And what are the big economic stories that you have been working on right now?
Well, today they had a multi-billion dollar, about a $26 billion settlement with the 5 largest banks. The Obama administration agreed with the 5 largest banks in a deal that addresses some of the abuses and foreclosures when people's homes are taken from them. The sum of money is the largest settlement since the tobacco lawsuits in 1998. Is a complex settlement involving the states, the federal government, 5 major banks, J.P. Morgan, Citigroup, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Ally Financial, which is kind of tied to GM and Chrysler. The deal does not fix the housing market. It doesn't come close, but at least it addresses in a public way some of the abuses and dedicates this money not to people who were foreclosed on, but people who are what's called underwater, who owe a lot more than their home is now worth a lot less than their mortgage. And that's really the bigger issue in our housing market. So it's not a cure-all, but at least it focuses attention back on one of the big drags against the economy, which is important.
Kevin Hall, how much longer some might ask, how much longer can the Obama administration continue to bail out the banks? And is it because we're in an election? Some people some experts, in fact, have said that a more appropriate settlement rather than the $29 billion figure, it had been bandied around as this was being discussed in the last few weeks between 24 billion, is that right?
20 to 36, I think, a pretty wide range. Yeah.
And some had suggested a more appropriate settlement could have been north of 400 billion.
Oh yeah, this is a drop in the bucket compared if you believe that roughly 1 in 4 homes in this country is worth less than its mortgage, which means they can't easily refinance and they can't sell without a steep loss, and 43.5 million homes out there with a mortgage, a lot more that don't carry a mortgage, but you can see the numbers are 11, 12, 13 million. This settlement involves maybe 850,000, maybe 1 million tops, so it's a tenth of the market that's out there. It tells you how big this problem is.
Kevin Hall, we want to stay with you just a second. And you say that this settlement, this $29 billion settlement, is not going to solve the housing problem. What will?
Well, what will is what can't be done. I mean, somebody's got to lose. Banks don't want to lose. Homeowners don't want to lose. Bondholders who own the pools of mortgages that are pooled together into a complex bond don't want to lose. So right now you've had a standoff for 5 years and nobody wanting to take the hit. Banks don't. If a home is worth 30% more than its mortgage, and you're not willing to forget it, that write-down is the solution. But who takes that loss? Does the taxpayer do it? Taxpayers don't want to do that anymore. The banks don't want to lose that money, and so you have this standoff and this muddle along, which, if this continues at this pace, we'll be in this another decade from now still.
Well, Andrew Bond, you're an American taxpayer. Thank you for carrying this burden, sir, today. Because really, Andrew Bond, wouldn't you say, as a political analyst with the Gulf Institute, wouldn't your analysis could it be that ultimately it's still the American consumer and the taxpayer who's bearing the burden of this settlement that Kevin Hall just described for us?
It is. It definitely is. It's because that's who the American government gets the money from, is the American taxpayer. And in order to solve the crisis, we have to have the money. Again, that's the taxpayer. So, I mean, yes, with the economy going up, maybe it'll lessen some, but everybody will still be affected, especially the taxpayer.
Lawrence Stansburg, we don't want to overlook you and want to thank you for the taxes you paid into this as well. What's your take? I mean, it's exciting news that just went down, that they finally got to this settlement. What's your take on it?
I think we're in a very precarious position, and maybe it's time that we start to critique a financial system that functions by mortgaging and leveraging the wealth of future generations. It has to stop.
Well, you're not dressed like the occupiers, but isn't that what the occupiers said? The 99 percenters are not being represented, and here we see the 1 percenters. Is it too harsh, Kevin Hall, to say it's like a guy who's driving and he stops, and instead of getting the ticket because he was going 150 in a 25-mile-an-hour zone, gets a warning ticket instead of actually having to pay the cost of his crime?
Yeah, and he also gets the warning ticket, 3 years after he ran the signal. I mean, I think that's the delay in this, the fact that it's coming in the 4th year of this term. They just announced in the State of the Union address that they're going to form a task force to look at the origination and securitization, the bundling of these pools, which is what Wall Street did, which is really at the heart of this mess. Well, you're announcing a task force 4 years, almost 4 years after you come into office. It's hard to take that real seriously or with credibility. And I think that if there was a time to have done it, it would have been in the past. I think the reason they didn't is because the economy was so precarious, banks were teetering. But now when you're hitting banks at the very time that you want them to increase their lending, this probably isn't the best time to do this either. So, you can see both sides of this issue, why they didn't go faster and why they're doing it this late. But at the end of the day, it's like punishing someone who ran the speed signal, the stop sign 4 years ago, not yesterday.
All right, we're going to talk more about the economy. Now we want to go on the street and hear what folks out there have to say about the American economy from their point of view right now.
I think that we are still in a recession. I feel lucky to have a job, but it's definitely something that's on my mind that I'm worried about. I was actually, as you stopped me to answer these questions, I was checking my bank account and trying to figure out whether I needed to transfer money from one place or another, or how I was going to make it to the next paycheck. So I guess that's a sign that we probably are.
I think that's a very difficult question to answer. Personally, I observe from the newspapers, what I read is that there are a lot of people who are unemployed. It could be because of their educational background. It seems in the press recently that they focus more on that unemployment is, or the folks that have been unemployed for long periods of time, they don't have high school education or haven't completed high school or just have high school educations. There hasn't been that much, as far as I've seen, about people who have been laid off for different reasons. So to answer your question, I think things are getting better here.
I mean, the things that are happening, people are losing their houses, people jobs. There's no money. I mean, in terms of, that's how I see it. There's just no money, People are losing their houses, more people are starving, and you see it all day on the news. You see more people in the streets sleeping outside. The shelters are full. Sounds like recession to me. What do you think?
Kevin Hall, some 750,000 borrowers, I read here, in this new settlement could get better deals on their refinancings or their foreclosures. That really could, looking on the sunny side, that really could make a positive difference for at least on almost 1 million Americans.
Yeah, for them it will make a difference. And the bigger knock-on effect on something like this is the more money people have in their pockets, the more they spend, the better they feel about consumers. Sentiment and consumption drives about 2/3 of the U.S. economy, or has traditionally in the last couple of decades. So, anything that happens that gives people more money in their pocket and improves their lot and improves the housing, because as the president noted in his statement today, it's not just helping these people, but it benefits their neighbor, their neighborhood, and it has the net effect of pulling up home prices, or at least holding a line on home prices in a neighborhood. The wealth effect, one of the reasons people felt so down and were so down is stocks were going backwards, their 401ks were going, their pension plans were going backwards, and their home prices. Well, stocks have come back, wages have come back a little bit, home prices haven't, and so that's kind of the missing ingredient in terms of getting people to feel better. People can't move for a job because they can't sell their house. There's a lot of kind of a hidden effect of this. You hear about pent-up demand, where there's pent-up supply. A lot of people who'd like to move into a bigger house, but they can't because they can't get out of the house they're in. They can't sell it. That means they're not buying carpets, they're not buying wood floors, they're not putting new cabinets in. So it's all a chain that happens when it's moving forward, or in this case, backwards.
Kevin Hall, you're absolutely right for most folks, but I never understand why somebody wants to move in a larger house. You just have to clean more. Is the United States, Andrew Bond, is the United States in recession? Are we out of it?
I think we're still nimble. We're still in the point of, we're in a recession, but we are moving ahead. We are slowly moving out of it, but it's still going to be a very long process to recover. I mean, we didn't get into this mess very quickly. It took a while for us to get into the recession, and it's only going to take a while for us to get out of the recession. So
that's an astute observation, sir. Lauren Stansberg, recession, do you see a recession in the United States right now, or is it all full speed ahead and upward?
Well, I think regardless of what the economic analysis may be, depending on who you ask, the reality is that people are having a hard time buying food and clothing for their children. People are having a hard time, students are having a hard time paying student loans off, or deciding perhaps not to get further education because it's too expensive. I think that in the long run, whether or not you want to call this a recession, the reality is that 50 years from now, the education level of the American citizen and their sort of average wealth that you might want to compare on a sort of relative world scale is going to be significantly different than what it was 50 years ago. And if that's a future that we want to avoid, we have to start taking serious looks at how some of the most difficult to deal with consequences of this recession can be met on a social services basis, whether that is through government social services or private organizations and charities that step up to the plate.
It was interesting that Mitt Romney kind of stepped in the doo-doo in his comment about, I'm not worried about the very poor. He was making it in the context of a broader thing. Because what was more striking that didn't catch so much attention was the follow-up statement to it was, I'm not worried about the very poor because there's a safety net, and if that safety net is broken, then I'll look at fixing it. Well, I don't know anybody who doesn't think the safety net isn't broken, and I think that the strains on the social system, look at the state Medicaid systems, all the stimulus money, so much of the stimulus money went to help states deal with the Medicaid burden, with the burden of the WIC programs and children, the children of the recession. There will be years and years of academic research done on what's happened with children from this recession. The Pew Research Foundation today had a report out about new college graduates and how they have the highest unemployment rate since records have been kept. That has lasting consequences about what they feel about the buy-in in the economy, what they feel about buy-in about higher education, the social effects of this. Technically, we're not in recession, but you could argue that pockets and age groups and demographics still are.
I want to shift this now to the impact of the European economy on the United States economy and read you a quote from, I guess, at about 2 a.m. European time this morning from one of the members of Parliament, the Green Party member of Parliament, who was in negotiations trying to find a solution. And he said, at 2 a.m., all I can say is a line from the Beatles. It's been a hard day's night. And this morning, it looks like Greece has an agreement to make $400 million more in cuts. The stakes, of course, are the $172 billion bailout. What about that impact of what goes on in Europe in the economy? Important to us, important to our progress?
You want to tackle that one first?
You can go ahead.
What happened soon after that is they had several high-level government resignations in protest to the deal, and I don't know many analysts who don't think the Greeks will eventually default. So if you've bought another 6 months, and the whole European response has been to buy time, keep trying to sort it out, keep trying to build up political will, but at the end of the day, there's an ugly reality that one of the things that's unique about Greece, and I've had the fortune or misfortune to have been in Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico during their collapses in the 1990s. So all of this is here and abroad has it follows a pretty regular pattern. But what's striking in these other places, the countries have been forced to devalue their currency. Everything is worth 40% overnight less. People start investing again because it's cheap. Greece can't do that because they're tied to the euro. Mm-hmm. And the United States has been, it would be happening here if not for the fact that we're the world's reserve currency. So those two factors have helped. But in terms of the impact on the U.S. economy, it's hurt our exports. You see that in the trade data. It hasn't been a major hit, but it's been a drag on one of our drivers. The bigger question is they have what we had here with the mortgage-backed securities that blew up, the derivatives. They have what's called foreign exchange swaps, and it's a risk swap. It's complex. We won't go into great detail, but they have trillions of dollars worth of this stuff that only works if the euro is something you can believe in. If Greece leaves the eurozone, the whole idea of a euro as a currency comes under fire, and then you may have an explosion that will make ours look like, a walk in the park. So I think looming over everything is, the key. The Europeans understand they have to keep the euro together no matter what it takes.
Well, and some, I have friends over there, lived there for a long time myself, and some of the parliamentarians in the European Parliament, some of my sources are telling me that in many ways that's already baked into the cake. What is your take on it, Lauren Stansburg?
Well, I'm curious to talk about what if Greece does default? What would the consequences of that be? And not just Greece, but thinking about all of the countries all over the world that are heavily indebted. These countries exhibit an economic pattern or trend towards accruing incredible amounts of debt at the sovereign, federal, sometimes dictatorial level, and then that debt burden gets passed on to their citizens for perhaps hundreds of years to come. It strips the possibility of these countries to develop infrastructures for education, for healthcare, for agriculture that are sorely needed. We're basically talking about a financial system that ensures the longevity of global poverty. And it's a system that is designed to peak and to fall. Why do we perpetuate ourselves in the struggle when there may be alternative financial systems that we could be exploring?
There's a real parallel between our crisis, and it's in both cases banks became unhinged from risk. They didn't see the difference between someone who had no stated income and someone who had stated income when they made a $700,000 mortgage to someone who had $40,000 of income. Here, over there, Greece was treated as Germany. Its bonds were worth the same. They were AAA rated. How did the rating agencies, the same bad actors here, manage to give AAA ratings to Ireland when its current account deficit had ballooned, like 20%, negative 20? So a lot of in both cases, we became unhinged from risk. And as Lauren rightly said, somehow or another we've lost sight of some basic measures for institutions, and there are long-term consequences on infrastructure. The Greeks, I think, we had a story, our reporter Roy Gutman was there recently in Greece, and a port city had 60% unemployment. And how do you function as a country with 60% unemployment?
Mr. Bond.
We definitely are going to have to see alternative forms in restructuring and helping countries get out of debt, such as Greece. And in particular, countries like Greece that are tied into regional blocs, such as the euro, and where we have, and especially where we have countries that are highly performing like Germany, and then low performing countries like Greece, Ireland, Spain, Italy, and Portugal. So we have to have alternative plans put into place to deal with it, because the structure that we have right now isn't really working for anybody.
Well, I've got a couple of things I want to get in here really quick. Just looking at this agreement in Greece, it meant cutting the minimum wage down to $700 a month, U.S. dollars. That's $4.40 an hour. That apparently they have agreed on this morning. Now, is the media in the United States covering this in an unbiased and just fashion?
The Greek crisis?
Yes.
I would think so. I think it's more a question of have they covered it enough. I mean, I think the changes in the newspaper industry, newspapers tend to go into a little more depth than this format, and there have been a loss. Most of the major papers don't have correspondents in each country anymore. The New York Times, the Washington Post used to have that. That's all disappeared. So you have a lot of younger reporters who don't have a lot of built-up history, a lot of wire service reporters. So I don't think you're getting the quality reporting that's kind of telling you really what's going on and connecting the dots. I think had you had that, people would have identified the risks in Spain and Italy a little earlier. I think, markets understood that well before reporters did.
So we're being misled?
I don't know about misled, but I think we're being underserved in terms of the attention it gets and thinking through the consequences of it. I gave you the example of the derivatives and that big exposure. You don't want to be alarmist, but it's important to also let people know that this is, what is the best case scenario, what's the worst case scenario, and here's how you could get to the worst case scenario.
All right, we're going to now go back to the street and get the take on the good old American out on the street and what they're saying about the impact of the European economy and the European situation on the American pocketbook.
Of course, since Europe is one of the largest economies, if whatever happens in Europe is going to affect the United States, definitely.
I mean, inevitably. I mean, the way economics work now is that all the global markets are tied together. Once you get a whiff of something bad happening overseas, our markets hit a tick, they start going crazy, so there's no way to separate one from the other.
Well, it certainly makes the whole conditions for the world worse. And looking at Europe, I'm reminded of the Confederation of the U.S., of all the trouble that the U.S. had between 1776 and 1787. And it was forming a understanding that the Confederation meant there wasn't a strong center at all that led to the Constitution, and the European states would be lots better off if they were united. So the United States' economy is better than Europe's, thanks to the Fed and thanks to the stimulus package, and thanks to things that we now think are inadequate, but at least compared to the Depression, we're much, much better than back in 1929.
Just a quick question for everybody here. I'm going to ask you to vote right quick, or at least show of hands. Right. The number one, how do you get your news mostly? Do you get it from cable news? Raise your hand. First and foremost. Internet, raise your hand. All right. 3. And network news. Newspapers.
Well, depends. Newspapers and internet are kind of the same at this point.
Yep. That's absolutely right. Well, that was the study I just looked at before the broadcast here today, and that most folks, number one, these days get their information from the cable, second, from the internet. I want to come back to talking just quickly about something that is it true, and this may be something that the mainstream media overlooked in the United States, that what Greek had going on has been the contention of many, and you may have been referring to something like this, Lauren, a bit of a kleptocracy. That is the conservative government that preceded Papandreou, with a Goldman Sachs consultant, rearranged the books, shall we say. Is that an accurate reflection of the reporting, and is that part of the economic problem that you were describing, Lauren?
Well, I think the media has done a strong job of giving reporting and coverage to the historical and sort of complex financial dealings that are going on right now in Greece. The challenge that they've yet to step up to is how to translate those events into a financial language that Americans can understand, particularly with regard to how it relates to them personally. And I think that the sort of behind closed doors politics that have led Greece to the crisis they're in now should be a warning bell for people in the United States who are critical of how some of our own economic policies may be taking place outside of the lens of public discourse.
Well, one of the nail that the Republican candidates pound all the time, and where do they get this, Mr. Hall? The lack of or over-regulation in the Obama administration has been a pull on the economy. But yet in a place like Germany with an unemployment rate of 5.5 and a market-based economy, as they refer to it, with very specific, typically German kind of administration, we're seeing a more productive economy. Are the Republican candidates in that economic critique fair?
Well, I think as you rightly note, they miss this question of, well, how do they have all these social programs and a competitive economy and arguably the world's leading export-based economy. One of the things the Republicans do in criticizing Obama quite frequently is to make mention of, he wants to build European-type programs and, bad-mouthing Europe, when in fact the latest statistics, when you look at this, particularly Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Holland, the social mobility and the ability to move from bootstraps, from being poor to becoming wealthy, we are far down the list. We're at like number 7 or 8, and these European countries are all at the top. So this idea that somehow Europeans aren't competitive is nonsense. And in fact, we ourselves are becoming more and more concentrated with wealth and less ability to climb that social ladder. And that's troubling, because that goes to the character of who we've been as Americans.
There was a fascinating article written by a young woman in a Brussels newspaper this week, a 20-year-old student receiving, the Germans call it BAföG, basically a scholarship of $1,000 a month, and her complaining in the editorial that wasn't enough. Mr. Bond, do American students need that kind of standard?
We do need a standard, because I myself, as a former American student, a postgraduate, I had no support. The only support I had was in the form of loans, which we all know how loans are. It takes forever to pay them off if you're lucky. But my colleagues at my program who were from European countries who did have government support, they're not going to have the same effect on their lives as I'm going to have in mine. We do need to give more financial support to our students. There isn't enough.
Lauren?
I may be biased. I do think that type of support would have beneficial consequences on students, not only because it would take the burden off of the family. The traditional sort of way that most students go to college is because their parents pay for them. That's increasingly an unviable model in our education system. I think that it's very intimidating to think that the U.S. education standard is falling behind the global standard every year. And if the government had an opportunity through policy on education reform to make it more possible for more students to attain higher education, it would make us more competitive in the global marketplace. And I can't think of a single reason why that should be objected to.
Now, we're talking about the impact of the European economy on the U.S., but Mr. Hall, what you discussed got me to thinking about what the presidential candidates are proposing right now in the United States. And what are the Republican candidates proposing to fix the kinds of lack of investment in infrastructure, educational infrastructure, that Lauren has referred to? And as I sat here thinking, I couldn't recall any. Mr. Obama hasn't had a new initiative that I can think of in that regard in a while. The only one that comes to mind is the medical doctor Jill Stein, who's running for the Green Party, and she has taken on this issue that you raised, Mr. Bond, of this debt. The debt. All the young folks I talk to are, oh Lord, I can't declare bankruptcy. I have these debts and I can't pay my rent. What are the proposals out there?
Yeah, I think the number bandied about more recently is about 27. I think the average college student coming out now owes $27,000 right off the bat. So they come out about $27,000 backwards when they leave college. What you're hearing mostly is what they're going to get rid of, not what they're going to replace it with. Gingrich has said he's going to get rid of the Dodd-Frank Act, which was the most major revamp of financial regulation since the Great Depression. If you're going to get rid of that, what are you going to do to address all those things that brought us to where we are? You've got to replace it with something. We haven't heard that. He also said he was going to get rid of Sarbanes-Oxley, the accounting reforms that were passed after the Enron scandal. So He seems to be wanting to take two of the biggest burdens off corporate finance and the financial sector without saying what he's going to replace it with. Santorum basically has talked a little bit about manufacturing, but not much. And most everything's been socially focused. Ron Paul, we of course know, is a libertarian. He wants to get rid of the Fed, wants to go back to the gold standard. He's been the one guy who has talked about concrete proposals. Romney has his book and his plan. Most of it is conceptual. We need to promote this, do more of this. He would not bring major changes. He's talked about lowering the corporate income tax rate. That's fairly concrete, but the president has proposed that. Congress has discussed it. The big thing hanging out over everybody.
So it's more of a pep talk than action?
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah, I would say that's absolutely correct. But what's most interesting about the lack of detail is right after the November election, you have a lame duck Congress. Either the Bush-era tax cuts come back into a sunset, go out of disappear.
And the budget automatically gets balanced.
Yeah. Or you've got to do something about that to keep them, and then you've got to figure out how do you keep the deficit from widening. So the most central key issue for our economic health, none of the four candidates nor the president are talking about it right now.
Let's shift over now to the Middle East and the Egypt specifically first. You have those positive steps there this week where the military reacted to pressure on the street, the demonstrators coming out and saying, move up the presidential election. This is something that they have been pushing for many months, and action came. At the same time, on the flip, we have this challenge of these 19 Americans who are being held and charged from the NGOs. It's a tough negotiated pass, Mr. Bond. Mm-hmm. Any suggestions for those in charge?
Any suggestions? I think the Egyptian military leaders right now do need to probably evaluate how they're handling the 19 Americans who will be on trial, because if that case does go through, it will greatly affect Egypt-American relations, obviously. There has been talk I know both houses on actually sending in bills to temporarily suspend aid to Egypt pending on those cases. So my advice to the Egyptians would be to sit back on those cases a little bit. So
go gently is what I'm hearing.
Yes.
Mr. Hall, out of the State Department this morning, there's back channel discussions saying that why these 19 were arrested and are still being held, Lauren, is that there's a vacuum in power in Egypt between the police, the military, and what really happened there. Is that your sense?
I would suspect they're basically pawns. I mean, they're strategic pawns at this point. I listened to some of the press conference yesterday where they were laying out the charges, and the judges, two different judges, were citing the fact that they weren't paying taxes and they were there on tourist visas. A country like that, where the informal economy is so much larger than the formal economy, to bring charges against somebody for not paying taxes is just laughable. And so I'm sure these 19 are being used in terms of getting something out of Washington, having some leverage over Washington in this negotiation. But at the end of the day, they're running out of friends.
If I may interject, what you have is that you basically have two branches of government, the military and the judiciary systems, that are trying to gain a foothold into power, especially among the protesters, and saying, we're the ones that can lead you now, come with us. So,
Lauren, as a media strategist, is the policy as presented by the Obama administration handling this? Are they doing a good job of it?
Well, let's keep in mind that even if there may be vacuums of power, as you say, Egypt is still a sovereign nation. They maintain autonomy, regardless of what their political motivations may be in bringing these people to court. They are not yet incapable of enforcing the laws in their own land. So I think we need to tread carefully on this one, because it will reflect the U.S. policy on Egypt for many years to come.
All right, we're going to go back out and to the street and see what your average American has to say about this.
I think in general it's a good policy. I don't think they have a great deal of choice at this point. Events to some extent are beyond their control.
I think so far pretty good. I think we've been on the right side of in Libya and Egypt and Syria. So I think we're on the right course there.
You know what? I think the United States needs to concentrate on the United States, really. Because, that's a saying is you can't clean up in your own, go somebody else's backyard if you can't clean up in your own backyard. So the United States needs to stay over here and take care of the United States and let the other countries take care of themselves.
Well, the issue, certainly if you look at the opinion polls in the United States, Americans appear to have had their belly full of war. 80% are calling for the United States to bring their troops home. Ron Paul hits that nail on the head at every campaign appearance, as does Dr. Jill Stein. Doesn't seem much political will or certainly popular support in the United States in the opinion polls
for
any active military involvement there
in Syria. Yeah,
I think we're back to the old days of our good offices.
Yeah, I think Syria is a little more complicated because you also have the historical ties with Russia, and there are regional reasons why it's not Libya. But I do think it raises. I think most Americans, believe in all those inalienable rights that all men are created equal, and when they see something like this, it is an injustice, and the administration is looking at it. I mean, I don't think it's something that people vote against because he didn't do more for Syria. It's interesting, though, that last night Santorum so broadly criticized Obama as being an appeaser-in-chief, when in fact he's probably done more in terms of getting international cooperation to literally have international troops in Libya. He's been very aggressive in going after sanctions, getting the whole world behind the Iran sanctions, Syria sanctions. More Syria sanctions are coming, perhaps a ban on flights out of Syria around the world. So I think this president has used his office in ways that have been fairly effective. If your goal is to continue to pressure but not have to commit troops, I think he understands, and there's no appetite for troops. But I think most Americans see what's happening in Syria and find it repulsive.
Thank you. Andrew Bond.
Mm-hmm. It's the Syria case brings to mind to me Tony Blair's right to protect scenario, which we had used to go into Kosovo and Bosnia in the in the 90s. But Syria is even more precarious because of its geopolitical situation in the Middle East. With Libya, it was easier because we could have NATO could influence Libya because of its geopolitical position being across from Europe. Syria, it's right in the middle of the Middle East, and it has the influence from Russia and China. War, I don't think is going to be the answer, just because Americans don't want to head that way, and I don't think the administration wants to go that way either. But there needs to be a strong and unified voice, not only from our government, but also from the Europeans more on effectively resolving the Syria issue through greater diplomatic channels, not only through the UN, but through outside as well. And I say that because with the Security Council of Russia and China, who we know who has veto power, and nothing will really happen through the UN because of that power that Russia has to really resolve the Syrian crisis.
I think there's been a quantitative change in the nature of what's going on there, though. And I heard a program earlier this week where I thought one of the panelists was right on target, where he said, at this point, it's not about degrees, it's kill or be killed. The Assad regime thinks they're over.
Has the media been biased? That's the issue that we want to take up right now, and we're going to go quickly outside and see what our folks say out there, and we'll be back to comment.
I don't know. I think some sources are more liberal, some are more conservative, some are more grassroots-based, some are, more local with, local concerns, some are worldwide with worldwide concerns, so it just depends. Yeah.
I think they're fairly neutral, with one obvious exception, which I won't mention. But I think that they aren't holding the candidates to feet to the fire, asking them important questions. I don't care who slept with whom, but where do they stand on vital issues to the nation?
Kevin G. Hall, McClatchy newspaper, economics reporter, nobody here better qualified to see it from the inside and make a statement about it. Now, does your boss stand over you with a pitchfork and say, you have to report it this way?
Every day. It's just horrible. No, and I think the fair criticism is there's bias in that you decide what you cover and how you cover it. And that's the bias that's there. And it's not a liberal or a conservative bias. I think what's confusing for readers nowadays is that there are so many alternative sources. It's hard to figure out who's legitimate and who isn't. And example, I ran across something recently. One of the Kennedy clan was found to have taken money for representing an indigenous group in Ecuador against Chevron. Well, okay, the wires played it one way, but the blogs and the conservative spectator type things really made this sound like it was something draconian. And it was unethical, probably. Most people probably would have had a problem with taking money for for being a spokesperson for something like this. But they're the Kennedys. Are they going to sell their soul for $40,000? Probably not. They have a lot of money. Mm-hmm. So it's how things get covered, and then it just gets all blurry. And I think we've been fortunate that our chain has a reputation as hitting hard. Obama's folks hate us as much as Bush's folks dislike us. And, you're trying to get to the truth of the matter and inform the public. And I think there are a lot of publications out there that do just that. People go to them for that. And I've just never seen this inherent bias.
Lauren Stansbury, media strategist, part of your job is really to influence how it gets reported, isn't it?
Sure. Well, but let's also remember that increasingly journalists, along with doctors and healthcare providers, are being denied access, particularly in homes as we speak. So if we're not already alarmed or concerned, silence on the topic of Syria and what's going on now will be a much greater warning bell.
Speaking for our news organization, it is very difficult to get in Syria, and it's very difficult to get unfiltered information. I mean, I was struck when they had the images of the Russian foreign minister arriving in Damascus, how many people were out on the streets. I don't think all those people were sent out there by the Assad government. So I think there is, particularly in Damascus, a large part of the population who feels the country is falling apart and wants Russia to prevent that from happening. So I think that's a view that if there's a bias that hasn't come through in the coverage as much as perhaps it should have, that it's, these are areas of Syria that have traditionally been opposed to the government. It's not the first time they've had massacres there. In no way excusing it. But that kind of important bit of information is important to have out there. But in terms of getting in there and covering it, none of the major news organizations have been able to get people in there. We're all relying on Twitter feeds and kind of backdoor channels to get to people, and you're not getting an unfiltered full view of things on either side.
Andrew Bond, in your work as a political analyst, how do you shift through it all? How do you, addressing Kevin Hull's issue of it's hard to know what to believe and what not to believe, what to know is of value and what's just great fiction?
It is hard to know, but one of the great things about where I work is that we have really great people who are on the ground in places like Syria, Bahrain, Egypt, who can tell us what's happening. And these are people who we have vetted, who we can tell that they will be telling the truth as well as be independent. And in particularly, not only where we just talked about Syria, but also Bahrain has been having issues too with the revolution anniversary coming up next week. The government has actually denied visas to several news organizations. It's denied visas to CNN, LA Times, Washington Post, I believe, are the three big ones. So it is difficult to get the information inside. But, with the advent of social media, it has made it a whole lot easier, as we have seen with how the process of the Arab Spring, Arab Awakening happening. So.
Exactly. Bahrain, we're not hearing about it. It's not reported in the U.S. media. Is that biased?
Well, it is, and in fact, our Roy Gutman, who has recently closed down our Iraqi office and is moving to Turkey, he did some groundbreaking stories out of there where he documented all the raising of the Shiite mosques, because the Saudis, and I've done some stuff with the WikiLeaks documents that show the connection between the Saudi security forces and the Bahrain security forces, and the modus operandi in both cases for destroying the Shiite thing. But what our guy found, he actually had one of their ministers, presented him the documents and say, here's the proof. This mosque had been built in X date. It's no longer there. And the guy said, well, I don't know what to say.
Well, that's great news. One of and the other members of the mainstream have not covered that. And based on what you said, this move, you moved the bureau from Iraq to Turkey, I understood you to say.
Yeah.
That's going to impact the coverage?
Well, we have Iraqi staff. We've simply moved our correspondent out because we've kind of viewed the broader Middle East. Right now, I think every major news organization is trying to figure out how to do this with declining resources, because you've got Egypt about to blow up, Syria under fire, Iran, that tension going. Saudi Arabia is closed off, Bahrain, Yemen. I mean, you look across the spectrum, and everything it's a tinderbox. It's a very, very critical time there.
I mean, we talked about bias earlier. Well, in that region in particular, you have government bias of how they limit information on getting it out to the people as well as to the international community. So that makes getting information even more tricky, because you have to dissimulate who it really is from.
Now, we've got under a minute to go. Lawrence Stansburg, any key point that we've missed that you want to make right here?
Well, let's also remember that even if we don't have trained journalists out in the field who are assigned with the task of covering these stories, we have amazing resources in technology and the internet, with Twitter, with Facebook, all different types of social media, not just those two. But these are basically tools for anyone to report, to be a journalist on the ground. Truly anyone who, granted, they must have internet access, which is sometimes not always an egalitarian playing field. But I do think that this really sort of democratizes the way that journalism is changing with the increased availability of technology. Kevin G. Hall?
I thought it was very well said. I think technology is the technical revolution has become the revolution.
So a reporter out there with a little phone, or a guy or a lady out there with a phone, they immediately become a monitoring device.
And they've found ways around, they've created workarounds and ways to hide their IP address, and there are ways to do it, and they're outsmarting the governments.
Excuse me. And, of course, Twitter, the tremendous opportunity that, the tremendous opportunity Twitter provides also is, of course, the chance to embarrass yourself and say something quickly. Any final point, Andrew Bond? Quickly.
It's, as a policy analyst and political scientist, seeing how technology and social media have revolutionized the political sphere is just truly amazing, especially in this past year alone.
Fantastic. It has been great to be with you here today. Thank you for joining us. Lawrence Stansburg, Media Strategies Consultant at Mintwood Media. Kevin G. Hall, National Economics Reporter, McClatchy Newspapers. And Andrew Bond, Political Analyst, Gulf Institute. I am Carey Campbell. We thank you for tuning in this time. Join us again next time for more excitement, for more insight, for more intelligent conversation. The place where the news and the media meet. On Deadline, I'm Carey Campbell.